I'm Trevor Williams with Global Atlanta, and I wanted to welcome you to the relaunch of our Authors Amplified series. The series started 2 years ago in partnership with the Atlanta Global Studies Center, which is a collaborative center between Georgia State and Georgia Tech here in Atlanta, but has lots of partner institutions, including six that are part of a collaborative research effort called AgRec. And the center is exploring what they call global at home research projects through AgRec. And of course, that resonates with us here at Global Atlanta. Our whole raison d'etre, reason for being, is just to showcase Atlanta's international connections, particularly in business, but also in education, trade, culture, diplomacy, and these kinds of avenues. So I'm very excited today to be relaunching this series after a little bit of a hiatus, as we seek to amplify voices here in Atlanta that may not otherwise be. Although Mona, I will say, our guest today, has been in very high demand recently, given the subject matter of her research. But we find that the deep pool of expertise here in Georgia is sometimes limited to the silos of academia, and often when expertise is sought about international issues, people think that they need to go outside of Atlanta to voices in DC, New York, California, et cetera. So we had this idea that sometimes these sought-after thought leaders shine globally while being overlooked in our backyard. And so we wanted to kind of rectify that. So that's where the Authors Amplified series was born. We did this, we've had 12 events so far, if you can believe it, and we'll send out some links to the recordings that we've done in the past. And we're excited to be relaunching today. A few weeks, I guess, before the Atlanta Global Studies Symposium, which will be coming up April 13th through 15th, including a big day on April 14th, and in which I'll be also moderating an in-person version of Authors Amplified, which will be interesting and another experiment. So stay tuned for that. There will be many presentations, research presentations, panel discussions, et cetera. So we're excited about that and working with the Atlanta Global Studies Center on that. So here we are today. We're here with Mona Tajali. Mona is an associate professor at Agnes Scott College, researches and teaches in the fields of comparative politics, Middle East studies, and women's studies. I'm not going to read your whole bio. We'll get into it a little bit as we go. But she approaches these things from an interdisciplinary background, teaches courses on women in politics, Middle East politics and society, human rights, and international relations. The reason we are here today is that she is the author of the 2022 published book, Women's Political Representation in Iran and Turkey, Demanding a Seat at the Table, which is published by Edinburgh University Press. And we're going to talk a lot about that, so I'm not going to read this description, but I think it answers, and we'll get into this more too, how have women, this is one of the key questions, how have women in many Muslim majority countries been able to achieve surprising success despite significant constraints imposed by a conservative gender ideology and authoritarian political parties and systems? So that's the kind of kickoff, I guess, for what we're going to discuss. And you can see with that lead in why she's been in high demand recently with all that's going on in Iran and Turkey. But thank you, Mona, for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Really
My
appreciate
pleasure to
it.
be among you guys.
Yeah, thank you. And so tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive into the book. I mean, what's your background? How did what you're studying kind of come out of your own personal interests and personal heritage?
Sure. Yes. I'm Iranian American, and one of the main motivating factors for me to do what I'm doing right now, which is research and teaching on gender and politics and women's rights, is that I really strived to be what I like to define as a scholar who wants to be at the service of civil society. So I've had amazing mentorship along the way where I've had feminist academics who really sort of nurtured having one foot in academia and having one foot in activism. And so the types of research and the types of work that I did has really been inspired by the fierce and very well mobilized and politicized women's movements, organizing that I've seen in the Muslim world. I was able to do my PhD dissertation, and prior to that, my master's dissertation on sort of women's rights movements in Iran in particular, as an Iranian American, I had good access, obviously the language access and so on and so forth. So then as things progressed, I just, being in touch with the Iranian women's movements, it became that, well, political decision making, being represented in high level political politics is something where there's a big gap. By gap, I mean there's a high level of women's political participation. They vote, they are engaged in politics, but they're rarely at high level political decision making positions. And that's where a lot of my research has been focusing on, is how to close this gap and how to bring more democratic transitions. Because in my opinion, if women are not having a fair share of political decision making roles, whether it's in the Middle East or whether here in our own context, that is not a fully democratic and egalitarian context that we're talking about.
There you go. Yeah, and I mean that disconnect is really interesting, because one of the questions we'll get into later is how women have played high-level roles in certain areas of civil society, business, and elsewhere in the Muslim world, and which is a big, loaded sort of term. But speaking of that, why did you decide to focus on a comparative study of Iran and Turkey? I mean, these are civilizations versus countries, right? These are countries that we know of in the modern context, but really go back millennia in terms of their civilization impact. So talk about that approach. Why comparative versus just looking at one or the other? And when we talk about the Muslim world, obviously you could have gone anywhere. You could have gone to Indonesia. You could have gone to the Arab world, but instead you chose the Turkish and Persian context. So.
Yes, and I'm a big fan of comparative research, and I think because doing comparative research allows us to take into account some factors that maybe if we just focus on one country or one context, maybe we would miss on some of those. So the reason of why I picked Iran and Turkey was multifaceted, and you're right to say that these are civilizations. Both Iran and Turkey have a number of similarities with one another, but they also differ in really important ways, particularly when it comes to gender and politics. So both of them, yes, Muslim majority societies. Both of them have experienced periods of what I call intense secularization as well as Islamization, though currently it's in different degrees, where Iran transitioned into becoming a theocracy and Turkey has been dominated for the past 2 decades by a pro-religious political party. So definitely that religious sentiment is there. Other similarities is that both of them have very strong women's rights movements. And in fact, the fact that they are neighbors, sometimes in my research, I found that there is communication. In fact, the intense secularization and Islamization is also where the two have looked at each other. So during the secular eras, the Pahlavis of Iran looked at Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and vice versa. And there was a lot of exchange, particularly on the woman question, particularly on women's rights. But of course, they differ in really important ways as well. When it comes to gender and politics, Turkey does benefit from having a much longer history of what we call institutionalization of women's rights. There's also the institutions of political parties that Iran, unfortunately, is much, much weaker in. Turkey also differs in that it has not been marginalized from the international community the same way that Iran has been. Turkey was even a candidate for the European Union for a lot. So all of these things were quite important. One of the main motivating factors that I decided to do to compare this is because of a body of literature, a Western body of literature that really wanted to address the question of why, when we're looking across the globe, women's political representation tends to be quite low in the Muslim world. And this body of literature argued that it's largely because of Islam or Muslim culture. So that was one question that I wanted to compare, in the sense that I wanted to compare a secular country where the laws of the land are at least not influenced with Islam when it comes to gender and women's rights, whereas in Iran, there's religion. So really to be able to hone in to see to what extent is religion a hindrance or rather a supporter of women's political representation. And I did find some clarity on that.
Okay, good. We'll get into that too. Yeah. But it seems to me too, there are obviously differences in the system, though the trend has gone, I guess, in the same general direction for each country. Obviously, Turkey is not nearly as far along, and it's got a secular constitution, right? Like it's got the entire foundation of the republic about 100 years ago was based on secularization, whereas Iran's institutionalized religious authority. So. So, I mean, I guess that made it an interesting vector to kind of see like they're on the same continuum, but they're
Exactly.
also have different absolutes.
Very different.
Yeah.
Very different absolutes. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, level set for us a little bit the level of formalized or institutionalized participation of women in each country when it comes to national political or electoral bodies, I
Yeah.
guess. I mean, it
Yeah.
seems
For
to me
sure.
that Turkey may be farther along, but um,
Yeah, definitely. So that's one thing that so in my research, what I argue is that women's political representation, it depends on multiple factors,
mhm.
and in fact, focusing on just one cause or one issue will not give us the full picture. Like to say it's just
Mhm.
Islam or Muslim culture
Right.
will definitely hide away the impact of institutions and political parties and male
Mm.
party leaders, or the role of the campaign financing or other things like that
Yeah.
play. So that's where my research went in. And also the other thing that I did with my research is that I rather took a bottom up approach versus a top down approach. That I really was interested to see how are the women's rights movements and groups trying to increase their level of political
Mhm.
representation, recognizing that this is one of their central demands. How are they maneuvering from within these institutions and these
Mm.
barriers to be able to reach this? And that's because in both contexts, we've got male dominated political parties where gender discrimination is a major
Mhm.
obstacle.
Right.
But nonetheless, we have had surprising successes. And so
Mhm.
my research is all about how have we had these surprising successes, despite the fact that both countries currently, or at least during the time that I'm doing my research, it's in Turkey. It's also during the AKP or the
Yeah.
Justice and Development Party rule. Is that they have a conservative gender ideology that women's primary duties
Mm.
are to be within
Household.
the
Yeah.
domestic sphere, but yet we are seeing these. So yes, in the case of Turkey, it's the multiple factors, particularly the factor that there was a party that came to power that wanted to, in a way, distinguish itself
Mhm.
from more of its Islamist predecessors.
Mhm.
And this is where Erdogan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, played a really important role with utilizing women to, in a way, to highlight that he's different
Right.
from the Islamists. He's more modern and
Yes.
yet religious. And a lot of women welcomed this
Mhm.
shift. A lot
Mhm.
of women, very much recognize this. I had interviewees from within the AKP who considered women as the engines of the party. That
Mm.
had the party not been open to allowing women in its women's branches, they would not have succeeded the way they did. So yes, through all of those pressurings, we did see notable increases in the rate of women's parliamentary presence, which currently it's around 14.7%, which is among the highest it's been.
Mm.
It's been, but it's still below the global average of
Yeah.
25%. Iran, you're completely right. It's
Mm.
much lower than that. It's in the single digits. It's around 5% only in terms
But
of
it is, I
parliamentary
mean, it
presence.
is permitted, right? Like it's
Oh yes,
so ostensibly, right? But
exactly.
so what are some of the non-religious hurdles that you face? And then how do the women themselves feel that Islam particularly is a hurdle or not?
Right, right. Yes, the major hurdles, which is universal, in fact, is sort of the institutional obstacles like the role of male party
Mm.
leaderships and the electoral systems and so on and so forth. So, in both contexts, unfortunately, the candidate selection process is non-democratic.
Mm.
Even though Turkey is much better positioned to be women friendly, which we do see it for, it has multi-party systems. Well, multiple parties get to, but it's really the party leaders that get to
Mm.
put together the list of candidates. Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his allies get to put the list of candidates.
Right.
This is where there's very little input coming from the women's movement, from the feminist
Mm.
movement. But obviously, when they're at the forefront of recruiting women, it is possible to see really
Yeah.
incredible what I call critical actors. Some of these
Mhm.
women who are outspoken on behalf of women's issues coming in. Otherwise, many of them what we call token women, or
Yeah.
those that may just be towing the party line
Mm.
versus really having a feminist agenda. And that's universal with Iran as well. We do see some parties doing better than others,
Mhm.
and religion on the role of religion. There's also a lot of diversity.
Right.
There's definitely with the context of Iran being that it's a theocracy and being that if you have any secular connotations, there's no way you can gain any
Right.
seats anywhere. This has led a group of women who consider themselves pious, yet at the same time egalitarian, to be able to maneuver their ways to be able to find some positions and actually challenge gender discrimination of the
Mm.
regime. actually become outspoken against some of those.
Yeah. Well, how does Islam allow for the pious and the progressive to go together in that context? I mean, I think it's really interesting. I mean, when you think about Islam, the interpretations are so broad depending on where you are.
Exactly.
But, it gives this very nuanced view of women and holds them in very high regard, particularly in the early part of the community. Yet you have this perception, I guess, at least from the West, that there's, and sometimes rightly so, that women are oppressed and kind of kept unequal, right? So,
Yes, exactly.
but
So
in the Iranian context, I wonder how they are able to use that as a tool to kind of
very much
ply
so.
things open more.
Very much so. Yes. So I devote an entire chapter on what I call religious discourses for women's political empowerment, where these are women, particularly the women who I call pious women who are active, like party women, active party women. Many of them do not see any conflicts or contradictions between their faith and absolute gender equality. So I had interviews with women who are involved even with the conservative movement, who are saying that we should be supreme leaders. Like there should be no restrictions on supreme leader. And then when you ask them, like, how did you come to this when the Islamic Republic of Iran has a lot of restrictions on women's roles? They would say, well, this is because of male misinterpretations. So, for instance, there, exactly what you said, religion, including Islam, is open to interpretation. There's a lot of verses, there's a lot of practices within that. Like, for instance, one thing that I was always cited was the Quran has the story of the Queen of Sheba, a very just, capable leader whose gender played no role at all. So they're saying, like, how can our religion allow a queen, and yet, our access to the role of the presidency be limited in the Iranian constitution? So these were the parts that they were challenging. But what's significant is that they were challenging them using the same language or using the same Islamic language that their rights were taken away from within. They were not using necessarily a secular language. Right. And what's also important in the Iranian context is that because the theocracy has been so successful with pretty much treating women as second-class citizens, is that you've had a combination or sort of a coalition building amongst secular and religious women, that they collaborate. And so when the opportunity arises for Iran to integrate more into the international community and use more secular language, my research showed that they do go for that. Like, they do want Iran to sign on and ratify CEDA, the Convention of Elimination of Forms of Discrimination Against Women. But if that's not happening, then they'll we'll use more of a religious, more of a religious discourse.
Have you seen that same? I mean, because Erdogan's period of 20 years ruling Turkey, I mean, it's progressed in a very different way than it looked like it was going to 20 years ago, right? It was very much, like you said, moving toward the EU, economic liberalization, moving western in a western direction. And now it seems to have gone the opposite way as he's sort of consolidated power with the backdrop of the whole Gulen movement and the whole coup and all of these things. So it doesn't seem hopeful that it's going back, that the pendulum is yet swinging back in the other direction. But have you seen women's movements in particular, adopting that same adaptation that you saw in Iran, like over that 20-year period in Turkey?
So in Turkey, it's somewhat different because they have the multiple parties. And what I have seen happen in recent years, despite the party's efforts to try to present itself as more moderate, as you said, as they're consolidating and as they became more and more authoritarian, very quickly the women's movements and women's groups, including the very much the pious women's groups, they saw through that. They saw through that, and now is basically a movement that we're seeing it's happening where there's a reclaiming happening of religion, of piety, where so for instance, some are calling themselves now Musalman feminists or Muslim feminists versus Islamic feminists to distinguish themselves from the political sort of Erdogan male-dominated, and they're very much outspoken against those sort of gender discriminatory authoritarian aspects of the regime. And more of youth are sort of joining forth. So this is something that I did not expect when I first started my research. As you said, I really thought this is sort of that post-Islamist phenomenon that we're seeing, where religion and rights are coming together. But with the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, from the attacks on women's bodily autonomy, it has become very clear that this is a party's conservatism is actually at the forefront. And in fact, many of the same women who felt energized by Erdogan and his party now feel that they were just instrumentalized. Women's issues were instrumentalized to reach another ultimate goal,
Yeah.
which was not necessarily egalitarianism, and even Kurdish rights movements
Mm-hmm.
are I would say, which I consider to be at the forefront of feminism. They very quickly they
Mm.
saw this even before many other groups did.
Yeah.
So yes, our hope is now to see what's going to happen in the next election, because we are aware that there is a very politicized and mobilized women's movement,
Mm.
and now we do see both secular and religious women coming together on this anti authoritarian, anti male dominated persona that has been dominating Turkish politics for decades.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Before we move, I do want to move to kind of concurrent current events or whatever, but I wanted to ask you about the title, like demanding a seat at the table, right? To me seems to highlight the agency of women versus the idea that they're just sitting back and waiting. We've sort of already talked about how they operate and within a context that's not so hospitable. But why did you kind of choose that framing in terms of the book? Was it just to kind of pay homage to the fact that women are not waiting around, basically?
Exactly. Yes, the entire book, as I said, it's that bottom up approach. And for me, it was really so one thing that ticks me off very much is whenever an election takes place or whenever a cabinet is formed, and let's say some women's descriptive representation increases. Descriptive representation just refers to just their numbers.
Yeah.
Um, Suddenly the credit goes to the male leaders.
Yeah.
They're like,
It's
oh,
their
look,
enlightened male leaders,
yes, it's
right?
like, look, all these women that Erdogan brought in, and that is far from the truth in the sense that, in fact, if Erdogan or many of these male parties, and I would say this is the same thing in the U.S. as well, when these accomplishments happen, it's thanks to decades of women's organizing. It's because these backdoor negotiations and pressuring and lobbying has happened on behalf of women that eventually male party leaders, who we know ideologically do not agree, because they come out and they overall they repeat themselves, they're like, we do not believe in gender equality, still allow these things to happen. It's because of that sort of agency, that mass organizing, and that decades long activism that has been happening. So one thing that the book is very clear about is that the women are the ones who need to get the credit, and this is thanks to decades of organizing that we've been seeing happening in both contexts.
They've pried the door open, and then the men take the credit for opening the door, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously we've had these two like really epical sort of historical events in each of the countries that are the focus of your book. So I guess starting with Iran, we've had these mass protests, and I can't say that I've studied them super closely, but obviously it was triggered by the death of a woman in custody who was arrested or taken into custody for not wearing a hijab appropriately, or at least not covering herself enough. You talked about the sort of, I don't remember the term you used, but sort of the assault on women's bodies or whatever. And tell us about that movement. What's happened? What has that shown you about your existing research and its relevance today?
Yeah, so the current women-led protests, which they've unified around the slogan of "Women, Life, Freedom," which is originally a Kurdish slogan. So for me, as someone who compares Iran and Turkey, and I've done field research in Turkey for many years and have done research in Iran for many years, it's been absolutely essential. Because I've participated in protests in Turkey where I had heard Genjian Azadi, which is Women, Life, Freedom, that it's uttered on Istanbul's streets, on the protests that I've been on. And then for the first time to see it be uttered in Iran is really, really important. And it highlights the intersectional aspects of it, that the woman who came and was killed by the morality police was a Kurdish. She came to Tehran on a visit, and this happened. And of course, her funeral was sort of one of those main moments where the women's movement, and thankfully others, including men, recognize that gender equality, women's rights, democracy, these are essential aspects that obviously the Islamic regime is not providing. And this was sort of a unifying force to say enough is enough.
Well, to me too, I think from the Western perspective, like you look at Iran and you sort of see this kind of opaque curtain of Islamism, or the Islamic Republic, and you don't see all the things that are bubbling beneath the surface. And these things pop up, and it's a surprise to us, but it shouldn't be a surprise to those who have been following the way these things have developed over time, because we've had these bursts in previous iterations. I'm not sure they've ever broken through, but I think you never know what's going to break through until it actually breaks through. Right? And so What's kind of your feeling about where things are going to go from this, or what might be the lasting effects
So
from it?
one of the main things that I see coming with the women life freedom movement in Iran is that the main motivator is that women's issues and women's concerns have not been taken into account. They have
Mm.
not been at the decision making table
Mhm.
despite their continuous demands. So in fact, I see that if there's any future for Iran, if women are not equal participants
Mhm.
in the future going forward, will be exactly where we are today,
Yeah.
right? Like none of this. So in fact, the anger. So you're completely right to say that we should not be surprised because a lot of this
Mhm.
has been systematic. A lot of
Mhm.
these types of oppressions have been building up. Women have never been silent.
Yeah.
They've always been protesting. And the latest episode is just the latest spark.
Right.
But what's interesting is that it is also different from some of the previous protests, is that finally we have men and women and
Mm.
elderly and the youth and the Kurds and the Arabs and the Fars coming together and saying enough is enough. There's no way we can, we can't have any more patience with the
Right.
Islamic Republic of Iran. We want to see that radical feminist
Mhm.
change.
Mm.
And I think the type of stuff that's coming out of Iran, like for instance, the charters of rights or the Bill of Rights or the strikes or the protests, despite the mass crackdown, we're seeing a very mature and mobilized and politicized public who are engaging in their
Mhm.
rights in this way. This is a really hopeful moment
Yeah.
that we need to pay attention to. This is a liberatory movement very similar to South Africa's anti-apartheid
Mm.
movement.
Wow. My own perspective on this issue was very much shaped by an Iranian woman I met in Turkey. We were having dinner, and she was basically being an apologist for all Iranian society, basically saying, "Hey, we're not what you see
Yeah.
on TV or on all the dramas that portray us as a closed off,
Mm-hmm.
completely opaque country." So yeah, you're bringing up these kinds of
There's a big gap
discussions in
between
my
the
mind.
population and the regime, obviously,
Exactly,
and that's
exactly,
something
and
that the Western audience, because you said you're right. I mean, Iran has been marginalized from the
yes.
international community. We don't
Well, and
have a
it's
good
interesting
eye
because
in
we
there.
want that same treatment, like when our foreign policy is criticized, we want to say,
Right.
hey, we're not,
Exactly.
the people are not the same as the government, and we can't be apologists for everything. Um, I wanted to move to Turkey, but I also wanted to ask you very quickly because we talked about this before. Um, why has the hijab itself traditionally been such a flashpoint in gender relations and politics? I mean, just give us kind of a brief. I know you could probably go on for another 30 minutes on that, but because I think that's important for American audiences to understand why that's the
Yes,
case.
yes. I mean, there's a lot of baggage with the hijab, and to me, it goes back to sort of bodily autonomy, the right to choose, the right to be able to express yourself as you feel, and it's also obviously a religious symbol. So, in the context of Iran, and when the women are burning their hijabs in bonfires, or the
Mm-hmm.
high school girls are taking them off and taking pictures of them,
Yeah.
these are really powerful images. These are not moments of anti-Islam,
Yeah.
but rather there are moments of demand for democracy and human rights
Mm-hmm.
and bodily autonomy. And I think that's the really important factor. So because of Orientalism, because of so much baggage associated with
Mm-hmm.
how we assume are women agents when they're wearing the hijab, or are they oppressed when they're wearing the hijab?
Yeah.
So these debates are there. In all of these discussions, rarely have women's own
Right.
voices been involved. It's oftentimes the state that says, so in Iran, we've had top down unveiling, where the Pahlavi regime actually banned the veil in the public sphere and
Mm.
actually punished veiled
Oh
women
my
if they
gosh.
entered in. This was as early as 1936. And then right after the Islamic
Mm.
Republic, the regime said, well, now my symbol is going to be a forced veiling.
Right. Right.
And women's input were never taken into
Yeah.
account. So what we're seeing happening right now, I think it's really critical to keep in mind that it's not anti-religion, it's pro human rights and democracy. And this is also something where many men are recognizing that unless women have the right to choose their dress, there's no other equality or
Mm.
freedom that we can even talk about, including freedom of expression, including freedom of media,
Mm-hmm.
including right to vote, where you actually. So I think all of these are part and parcel with one another that finally the Iranian population are recognizing. But interestingly enough, the regime is holding on very tightly to the
Mm-hmm.
veil,
Yeah.
which shows what a symbol it has become,
Mm-hmm.
what a flashpoint has become for them.
Yeah, definitely. We have one question that's already entered the chat. I'm not going to read it just yet. I'm not actually sure I can read it, but we're going to move to that in one moment. But I would encourage anybody else who has a question to go ahead and throw that in the chat as well. But wanted to ask you about, obviously Turkey is reeling from the earthquake that hit the southeast, or multiple earthquakes. obviously, from what I've been reading, I mean, everybody's traumatized, but at the same time, we hear that women are carrying a burden, right? As always. Do you think, and there have been political ramifications because there have been detentions of construction executives who were implicated in not fabricating the buildings correct or not constructing the buildings correctly, and leading to more deaths than necessary. How do you think this discontent from that is going to spill into the next election in Turkey, and the way that women are going to use their voice even further?
Yeah, this is what I've been hearing. I've been hearing, so it's one of those instances, as you said, there's sort of decades long marginalization of a section of society. So definitely the fact that the earthquakes did happen in some of the most disenfranchised parts of Turkey, that's a major
Mm.
factor. The women lens of it and the gender lens of it is that yes, whenever the state fails, which it does a lot of times, women are sort of as stereotypically being the nurturers, they come in and they try to sort of pick up the pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So in that regard, it actually can turn into becoming an opportunity to really unify
Mm-hmm.
women's movements, women's groups, and that's exactly what I've been seeing. I mean, just here in the diaspora, we're seeing the Turkish women's groups have been absolutely essential. Not only raising awareness about what's
Mm-hmm.
happening about the
Mm-hmm.
earthquake, but also in terms of funds and in terms of all of that. So in this regard, I think putting it into the framework that yes, the state has failed. The international community has also not been able to, give support in the
Mm-hmm.
extent as possible. So it's really time for that radical change, and women again leading some of these because they just have that more gendered experience of what
Yes.
does it mean when you're always given the shorter end of the stick, right? What do marginalized situations or contexts in Turkey really feel?
Mm.
So that's my hopeful optimist.
Yeah.
I We don't know what will
Exactly.
happen on May 14th.
Well, and one more question on my end, then we'll go to the Q&A. We talked about this before we got on, but I think the tendency is for the U.S. in terms of policy to kind of, and in terms of perception to kind of lecture or say, we're supporting these groups, et cetera. Um, what should female political movements in the U.S. or just the U.S. public in general learn from the movements that you've studied in Iran and Turkey? Flipping that equation around a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the way I like to define the Iranian movement right now, the protest, and particularly in its most latest iteration, is that it is a liberatory movement. It is a women-led movement. It's happening from within one of the most conservative authoritarian contexts that we know of. I mean, we've had executions happen
Mm.
from protesters, right? So this should just tell us how extensive the crackdown is. So, in these ways, the movement very much deserves the attention of the Western audiences. And there are lessons to be learned. There are
Mm-hmm.
lots of lessons to be learned. The fact that, as I said, the movement is being intersectional,
Mm-hmm.
that is a major factor to be able to see that there's populations, there's ethnic groups that have been historically marginalized, yet they are positioned into being the leadership roles,
Mm-hmm.
and the majority are for the large part are now showing their solidarity and trying to allow them that platform that previously would not have existed. So I think
Mm-hmm.
in these ways, and particularly the feminist movements, so for instance, just on March 8th of this year, I and many others, we created a feminist collective, and we put out a women's bill of rights,
Mm.
an Iran women's bill of rights. And this bill of rights was nothing new. It was basically building based on previous charters and previous bill of rights that the Iranian women have made. But in this context, we made sure that we had ethnic minority women within them, sexual minorities women within our groups. And I think these are really important moments, and it was not easy bringing such
Mm-hmm.
diverse groups and ideologies and tendencies together,
Mm-hmm.
but nonetheless it was really important to allow the space for exchange and allowing the minority or those marginalized, historically marginalized populations to be in the leadership positions. And I think this is
Mm.
something that the West is very hesitant to do because power is often concentrated into the hands of a select few, and those
Yeah.
select few are very happy with keeping that, and particularly having gender minorities and women
Mm-hmm.
coming in, or ethnic or racial minorities coming in. It's always thought of, no, 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 we'll take care of you,
Yeah.
don't worry, we'll take it, we know what you want. It's like, no, it's really the
Yeah.
experiences that should lead the way. So I'm very hopeful. Also, region wise, I think supporting a democratic and liberatory movement in Iran, a country that let's be honest, political Islam really gained a ground after the 1979 revolution. It didn't just affect Iran, it went beyond its borders. So something that feminist scholars like me are hoping that could this particular movement, if we pay attention to it, if we support it in the way those individuals support it, could it reverse that conservative backlash that we got exactly 44 years ago? So this is an opportunity that we have. It would be a shame to miss it. The international community needs to put pressure on the rogue states, Russia and China and many others, who are supporting, like one thing that what we're seeing happening is that the undemocratic countries are so united with one another. And then the democratic countries are divided, right, on how to pursue. And do we negotiate with the Iranians? Do we not negotiate with Iranians? So this is where it's a really important moment to listen to the protesters.
Yeah, great. I'm going to lean over so I can see this. There's often, I think this is from Nuru Akanyemi, there's often the charge that feminist movements in both Iran and Turkey are as a result of Western influence and therefore are foreign. I was actually going to ask this too, so thanks, Nuru. What is the relationship between Islam, traditional culture, and Western influence on women's movements in both countries?
Yes, I teach feminism at Agnes Scott College, and one of the key points is that there's no universal feminism, and that feminism is not a Western construct. Right. It's feminism, if you understand it to be beliefs and actions towards gender equality, they go back and they're quite historical. So yes, obviously in both Iran and Turkey, what we have in terms of some indigenous types of feminisms is like Islamic feminism, which are some of the examples that I talked about. So going back to those women-centered, feminist-centered reinterpretations of religious texts to basically highlight the compatibility between Islam and human rights and gender equality. So that's been really, really effective because it's been also a really direct response to the theocracy. So when women are seeing that their rights are taken away from them in the name of Islam, it's a really powerful tool to be able to contest that, to say, no, I'm using the same language as you. And just to let you know, your interpretation is different than mine. We need to have a more democratic processes of different voices need to be included in this.
I think the regime has tended to use the U.S. as a foil, right? To easily say, oh, this is just Western ideals that you want to superimpose on our Islamic society, and to be able to push back on that with Islamic language in a legitimate way, I think is powerful because you can diffuse that argument.
Exactly. It shows that it's very much internally driven, and they have had surprising successes. I mean, we have seen very discriminatory laws that were presented to the Iranian population as though they're written in stone because Sharia says so. They were reversed. They were reversed because it just didn't make sense in the modern times, and the Islamic feminists reversed them by actually saying religion. This is in conflict. Like so many times, I would hear from also my interviewees, my pious interviewees in Iran, that at some point when I was doing my research, Iran's parliament was only composed of 3% women. So one comment that was made to me was, if the Iranian parliament is 97% male dominated, that is an un-Islamic parliament. So the way they had understood Islam was like, Islam is about justice, is about equality. If you have 97%, which currently it's 94% male dominated, this is not Islamic. This is unrevolutionary as well, because one of the promises of the Iranian revolution was Islamic justice. So basically they're trying to call out the contradictions from what the elites promised, what they were going to deliver, and where they are today. And this is a really effective way to be able to push back.
Yeah, because it doesn't rely on some outsourced view of what's going on. So we have Lewis asking, can you speak to financial inclusion or exclusion of women in Iran and Turkey? That's a big question, but relates to one I was hoping to ask as well. I guess, the undertone there is if women don't have the same economic opportunities, how can they organize in the same way that men can?
Right.
It entrenches the power further if they're excluded from.
Yes, and I think this goes back to systemic discrimination that I mentioned. So one thing that's been happening in Iran, I can probably speak more about Iran on this than on Turkey. One thing that's been happening in Iran is that Iranian education, girls' education, is absolutely essential, and the state, prior to the revolution and also following the revolution, has been able to sort of foster that. And of course, families, and it's a very Middle Eastern culture as well, to really get your daughters educated. So we've had women do extremely well in higher education. At some point in the 1990s, in fact, 60% of the university graduates were women. But then when you looked at the labor market, it would be around 12%. It would be around 17%.
Yeah.
I think that's
A
what
similar
it is right
trend
now.
in Saudi Arabia right now, for instance. I think
Exactly.
it's 60 to 70% of the graduates are women, but
Then when
labor
it comes to
force
the
is not.
labor force, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is where, and then when you dig a little bit deeper, like for instance, if you want to say some of the service positions, like let's say in banks, right? Like banks are actually told, make sure you hire this amount of men, and then maybe a few women here and there. So there's these sort of like systemic discriminations that's happening, that is quite detrimental to women's rights. But at the same time, are women still very much aware of their rights? I mean, so in this case, I feel that economic access, particularly when it comes to political representation, that became a major obstacle. I mean, one of the things I would say in both countries, and I would say even here in US, right? I mean, if you don't come from money, it's very difficult for you to run for office, because political parties are not willing to invest in you, and so on and so forth. That's why you see maybe daughters or wives of individuals run, or you have these sort of dynasties, vetting for political power, and not the grassroots activists, and not the women's movement activists, because they just come from a much more disadvantaged position. But yes, I think that's also important to keep in mind, that despite the lower economic capacities that they have in terms of organizing, in terms of dialogue and discussions with one another, they're really advanced in that level of, because yes, they publish a lot, or they're involved. In fact, you could say that because they're not involved in the labor force, but they're highly educated, then they're able to turn their focus onto other aspects. Yeah.
Do you think that the economic argument is gaining steam? Like the fact that if you exclude basically half your population, I mean, we see this in the Sustainable Development Goals and all of these kind of international forums, right? The discussion around women having an equal footing economically being actually advantageous for the country as a whole, right? It's not subtractive, or like it's not taking away from men's position. It's additive to the whole.
Yes.
And that's, I don't know if that argument has been kind of trotted out there.
Yes, it has. And I think I would also add in there the other caveat, which is that let's define what do we mean by economic participation, right? Because
is it ownership, or is it,
exactly. Yeah. Or is domestic labor, the caregiving role, like that's not necessarily considered economic power, but we know, like during COVID, when suddenly people were forced inside, and then they had to like businesses actually fell apart, and people actually so I think that's another thing, that in fact this is where religion of Islam, according to some of the Islamic feminists that I covered, would allow some room. Like for instance, in Iran, there's a law that was passed in the 1990s. In fact, it's nothing new. That's called the wages for housework. That it comes from Islam, where there's a verse that says when even the woman needs to be paid for everything that she does within the household, including she needs to be paid for her breast milk that she gives to her own child, and that her husband has to give her. So this is like protecting women's right to property. And so this is one thing that Iranian women, in order to protect women's rights, that they wouldn't just get arbitrarily divorced after decades of working. You don't have any wealth. You're working in your house. You're not employed. Suddenly your husband leaves you. You're left with nothing. So the law says if a woman is divorced with no fault to her, the husband has to pay for every year that she worked in his household, and it's called wages for housework. And so that definitely deterred many men from just like getting up and leaving, especially after 20, 30 years, because it just meant more and more money that you had to give to the woman. So in those ways, I think it's a much more nuanced understanding that we have of economics. But yes, we have a long way to go to bring about that truly egalitarian and equal opportunities. I think that's what's really important here.
Well, I really appreciate the questions coming in. I'm going to try to read these last two, and then we'll close it out. Maybe the next time we can configure it so that y'all can actually speak and we can hear you, particularly when we have a smaller group like this. The third question says, it's established that we think of movements like feminism or projects like modernity from a Western lens, despite knowing that these concepts operate uniquely across contexts. How do both countries compare in regards to the definition of and progress towards modernity?
Yes. So yeah, I would say the women's movements that I studied, I would highly consider them indigenous women's movements, in the sense that they're very much locally based. They know their structures, they know their institutional frameworks, and they're working from within those. Now, is there communication? Is there dialogue with non-Iranian or non-Turkish movements and groups? Yes, definitely. So it's not to say that they're siloed. Another type of sort of work that I'm involved in is what is sort of transnational feminist networks. There's a major transnational feminist network that's happening. I mean, like between Iran and Turkey, I would like it to be more, but to some extent, we have had exchanges on women's movements, on feminist movements. And they are using some of the discourses coming out of the UN, out of the global feminist movements on gender equality, on banning violence against women. And I think this is really important where, yes, the question definitely highlights that we should not necessarily put a Western lens on it, that let's say anything that's religiously framed, we just be dismissive of it because religion in our mind is inherently patriarchal. Whereas in this case, like wages for
Or
housework,
it's separate from government.
Oh,
Right?
it is separate
That's
from
kind
government.
of the American ideal too.
Exactly.
Right?
It's never it's never fully separate from government. So I think in those ways it's important to keep in mind that this dialogue has been happening, but yes, they are indigenous. I would like to see more of that transnational exchange and cooperations happening, particularly among the Muslim world, but also with the non-Muslim.
I think there's an interesting follow up there that I'm not going to ask you to address about diasporas and how they can connect to. But,
Very much so.
And that was, by the way, a former student of yours, so that's fun.
Oh.
And I'm sorry I can't read the name from here. I think Lewis has one more follow up question, then we'll close it out because I know you have to get to another appointment. He says if he wants to ask about economic sanctions, I guess particularly on Iran, because I don't think we have any sanctions on Turkey right now. But does this help or hinder, some of these efforts that you've been discussing about with women's movements?
Yeah, very good question. So as I mentioned, Iran is a country that has been historically marginalized from the international community much more than Turkey is. And every time, so I've been following the Iranian women's movement at least since the reform era. So maybe the early 2000s is when, mid 2000s is when I started my research. Every time sanctions intensified, I saw sort of more weakening of the women's movement. So that in that sense, it was, limited access to resources. It was also, to some extent, it also even helped unify the people in support of the regime because they were saying like, oh, look at these Western imposed sanctions.
It's the foil.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That has shifted in recent years, particularly with the current movement, where there's much more, especially because the regime crackdown is very intense. And it's not to say that the Iranians want any sort of mingling or any interference, but one thing that does seem pretty clear is to sanction the ruling elites, sanction those who are pretty much benefiting from the crackdowns, benefiting from silencing of voices, benefiting from policies that are completely sort of gender apartheid forces. And that's because when you go ahead and you give legitimacy to movements and to groups that are directly involved in the crackdown, this is something that is quite costly for the population, for democracy, for movements. Whereas aside from that, anything else, I think it's important to keep in mind. So that's one thing that the protesters have been asking for is smarter sanctions, but also more technological support, like internet. One thing that we're seeing that the Iranian regime is really good at doing is like turning off the lights on what's happening in Iran, right? Restricting internet access. Yet, thankfully, we have a population that's very tech savvy. Yeah. They're very good with still taking their footages as much as possible. So that's something that if it comes to support, it would be the smart sanctions and then making sure that technological access is there so that we're aware of what's happening because the Iranians are not allowing any journalism, any independent journalism happening. It's literally whatever the citizen journalists are doing for us.
That's amazing. Well, that's a good marching order for us to end. So, Dr. Tajali, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it. We're going to close it out here and hopefully generate some discussion from the recording. So, thank you.
Thank you. Right. Thank you.
Thank y'all for participating.